There are places in the world where the sea doesn't just touch the land, it devours it. Places where the waters don't follow the rules we know, where physics seems to bow to ancient forces that transform ordinary waves into hammers capable of crushing steel like paper. The North Sea is one of those places, and this is the story of how its waters swallowed some of the most powerful warships ever built, transforming tons of metal and hundreds of lives into submerged memories in a matter of hours. This isn't just a story about shipwrecks, it's a story about human arrogance in the face of nature, about the price of war, and about how the ocean always exacts its toll. Before we continue, if you enjoy true stories that reveal the most fascinating mysteries of maritime history, subscribe to the channel and leave a comment about the time you watched this video. Now let's dive into this extraordinary narrative. To understand how the North Sea became a ship graveyard, we must first understand the nature of this body of water. The North Sea is not an open ocean. It is a relatively shallow expanse of the Atlantic Ocean, sandwiched between Great Britain and continental Europe. Its average depth is only 90 meters, but don't be fooled by these numbers. This same characteristic that makes it shallow also makes it deadly. When Atlantic storms push their water masses into this confined space, something extraordinary happens. The waves have nowhere to go. They cannot disperse in the ocean depths. Instead, they compress, accumulate, and grow vertically in ways that defy imagination. Norse sailors had known this sea for millennia. The Vikings who plied its waters knew precisely when to sail and when to stay ashore. They developed an almost religious respect for the North Sea, weaving tales of sea monsters and angry gods that inhabited its depths. But these weren't just superstitions. They were ways of codifying vital knowledge about weather patterns, treacherous currents, and the unpredictable behavior of the waters. When the 20th century brought industrialized warfare to these same waters, this ancient knowledge was largely ignored. Admirals trusted in steel, modern engineering, the power of steam engines, and then diesel engines. They believed they had tamed the sea. They were terribly mistaken. The First World War transformed the North Sea into a battlefield. The British Royal Navy and the German Kaiserliche Marine faced off in these waters in a series of encounters that would culminate in the massive Battle of Jutland in May 1916. But before this epic confrontation, the North Sea was already taking its toll in ships and lives. Admirals on both sides quickly realized that their deadliest enemy wasn't necessarily the rival fleet. It was the sea itself. The cruisers and battleships patrolling these waters faced conditions that no amount of training could have prepared their crews for. In September 1914, just weeks after the outbreak of war, the North Sea claimed its first significant casualties. 3 British armoured cruisers, HMS Aboukir, HMS Hogue and HMS Cressy, sailed in formation off the Dutch coast. These were no small ships. Each displaced over 12,000 tons and carried crews of around 700 men. They were steel giants, symbols of British naval power. But that morning, they encountered something neither armour nor guns could defeat. The German submarine U-9, commanded by Captain Otto Weddigen, was lurking in the murky waters. In less than 2 hours, all 3 cruisers sank. 1,459 men died. The attack was devastating, but what made the tragedy even worse was the behavior of the sea that day. The North Sea waters were rough, with medium-sized waves and piercing winds. When the first ship was struck by the torpedo, the other 2 approached to rescue survivors. It was standard procedure, dictated by humanity and naval training. But the sea didn't follow procedures. As the ships slowed and lowered boats, they became easy targets for the submarine. More torpedoes found their targets. The men who managed to abandon the sinking ships found themselves battling icy waters that sapped the heat from their bodies within minutes. The North Sea water temperature, even in summer, rarely exceeds 15 degrees Celsius. In autumn, it can drop to below 10 degrees. At these temperatures, hypothermia kills in less than an hour. Many of the men who survived the sinkings died in the water, waiting for rescue that arrived too late. This incident should have served as a clear warning about the dangers of operating large warships in these particular waters. But the logic of war rarely allows for such reflections. Both sides needed control of the North Sea. For Britain, it was essential to blockade Germany and protect shipping lanes. For Germany, it was vital to break that blockade and threaten the British Isles. So the ships continued patrolling, and the sea continued to take its toll. What made the North Sea particularly treacherous wasn't just its propensity for sudden storms and massive waves. It was the deadly combination of factors that came together there. Currents flowing from the Atlantic met colder waters from the Arctic. Sandbars and submerged shallows created unpredictable wave patterns. Dense fog could descend without warning, reducing visibility to virtually zero, and the storms that swept through it were notorious for their intensity and speed of arrival. High clear day could turn into a maritime hell in a matter of hours. Naval engineers of the time designed warships with certain assumptions in mind. They calculated the wave force the hull would need to withstand, the weight of armor and armament, and the stability required to keep the ship balanced during combat. But many of these calculations were based on more predictable ocean conditions. The North Sea frequently exceeded these specifications. Waves came not just from one direction, but from multiple directions simultaneously, creating interference patterns that could shake even the largest ships like toys. Waves that didn't follow the expected smooth progression, but instead appeared suddenly as walls of water, known as trough waves. During the Battle of Jutland, fought between May 31st and June 1st, 1916, 250 ships from both fleets faced off in the largest naval engagement of the First World War. The battle itself was confusing, chaotic, decided as much by luck and visibility as by tactics. But what many accounts overlook is the role that sea conditions played. The waters were relatively calm during the battle, which allowed it to take place. But in the days that followed, as the damaged fleets attempted to return to their ports, the North Sea showed its true temperament. Several severely damaged ships that could have been saved in calmer waters simply disintegrated under the added stress of waves and currents. The German battlecruiser SMS Lützow, for example, survived multiple hits from heavy shells during the battle. Her hull was punctured, compartments flooded, but she still floated. The crew fought heroically to keep the ship afloat, pumping water, sealing breaches, keeping the engines running. For hours it seemed they might get her home, but then the waves began to grow. Each wave that crashed over the damaged bow sent more tons of water into the hull. The pumps couldn't keep up. Slowly, inexorably, the ship began to sink by the bow. The crew was evacuated, and the Lützow was sunk by German torpedoes to prevent her from falling into enemy hands. But it was the sea as much as the battle that killed her. On the British side, the battlecruiser HMS Queen Mary simply blew up during the battle after being hit by German shells. Of the 1,266 men on board, only 20 survived. But what happened to these survivors perfectly illustrates the dangers of the North Sea. They were thrown into the water when the ship exploded, covered in fuel oil, many injured by the blast. The waters were covered with burning wreckage, burning oil, and the bodies of their comrades. But it was the cold of the water that nearly killed them. Even in early summer, the North Sea water temperature in that region was deadly. Those 20 men only survived because they were quickly rescued by nearby ships. Hundreds of others who ended up in the water of sunken ships were not so lucky. The stories of North Sea survivors during World War I are uniform in one respect: the sheer terror of the cold. It's not the chill of winter air, which can be combated with clothing and movement. It's a cold that instantly penetrates any clothing, that saps heat from the body's core, that makes muscles stop responding, that turns the mind to fog. Men who were strong swimmers found themselves unable to move their arms after just 10 minutes in the water. Men who grabbed floating debris found their hands frozen around the wood, unable to let go even when rescue arrived. The North Sea doesn't just sink ships, it kills the men who fall into its waters with brutal efficiency. But it wasn't just the large warships that the North Sea claimed. The destroyers and small patrol vessels operating in these waters faced even greater dangers in many ways. These smaller vessels were more agile and faster, but also far more vulnerable to the sea conditions. During storms, they were tossed like corks, their bows dipping beneath waves that flooded their decks. Their sterns lifted completely out of the water, sending their propellers spinning in the air. Many simply broke in half under the stress. Their crews had no chance of escape. When a destroyer breaks apart in a North Sea storm, it sinks within minutes, taking everyone on board with it. Naval records from both sides during World War I list dozens of smaller ships lost with all hands to the elements. Many simply vanished. They set out on patrol and were never seen again. No SOS was received. No wreckage was found. The North Sea simply swallowed them, and only much later, when they failed to return, were they listed as lost. These were the loneliest deaths. No battle, no glory, just men fighting the sea until the sea won. Their families received telegrams informing them that their loved ones were missing, presumed killed on active service. But the truth was, they had drowned in the dark and cold. Far from any witnesses, their deaths recorded only by the fish and the waves. World War II brought even more advanced technology to the North Sea, but it didn't bring greater safety. If anything, the war made these waters even more dangerous. Now, in addition to the natural hazards, there were mines. Thousands upon thousands of mines, laid by both the British and the Germans, floated just below the surface or anchored to the seabed, waiting silently to explode against any hull that touched them. Vast areas of the North Sea became minefields. Ships had to follow narrow, carefully swept routes, but even these were no guarantee of safety. Storms could tear mines from their moorings, causing them to drift into theoretically safe routes, or the moorings themselves could rust and break over time. The German battleship Scharnhorst was one of the most powerful surface ships in the Kriegsmarine. Displacing 32,000 tons and capable of traveling at 32 knots, she was a formidable predator. In February 1942, the Scharnhorst, along with the Gneisenau and the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen, carried out the famous Operation Cerberus, also known as the Channel Break. They sailed from the French port of Brest across the English Channel to German bases, challenging the British Royal Navy in its own waters. It was a humiliation for the British and a triumph for Germany. But the true miracle wasn't that they defeated the British, it was that they survived the North Sea. During the passage, the Scharnhorst struck 2 mines. Massive explosions ripped open her hull. Compartments flooded. The ship shuddered from the impact but continued on. Her armor and construction held. But then came the waves. The North Sea was in a bad mood, with 6 to 8 meter waves and strong winds. Each wave that hit the damaged ship sent vibrations through the steel structure. Engineers worked frantically to pump out water and reinforce weakened bulkheads. The ship slowed, making herself more vulnerable to attack, but she had no choice. Moving at full speed could have caused the damaged hull to tear itself apart completely. Eventually, the Scharnhorst reached German waters, but it was a desperate struggle. Some German officers later admitted in private testimony that there were moments during that passage when they thought the ship would sink not from enemy action, but simply because the sea would tear her in half. The Scharnhorst itself would meet its end not in the North Sea, but off the northern coast of Norway in December 1943, sunk in a battle with British warships. But of the nearly 2,000 men on board, only 36 survived. Most died not from the weapons but from the freezing water. When the ship sank, it threw them into the Arctic Ocean. Even those who managed to get into life rafts died of hypothermia before rescue could arrive. It's a grim reminder that in these northern latitudes, the ocean is as deadly as any weaponry. But perhaps no shipwreck better illustrates the destructive power of the North Sea than the fate of HMS Hood. Hood didn't sink in the North Sea. She was destroyed in the Denmark Strait between Iceland and Greenland in May 1941, hit by the German battleship Bismarck. Yet her history is deeply intertwined with the North Sea, as it was in these waters that she spent much of her operational career. Hood was the pride of the Royal Navy, a massive battle cruiser that for decades was considered the most powerful warship in the world. But she had a weakness. Her deck armor was relatively thin, a legacy of her World War I design. She was built for speed and firepower, not for the long-range missile warfare that would develop. During her years patrolling the North Sea, the Hood weathered numerous storms that tested her structure. Officers reported that during severe conditions, the entire ship vibrated alarmingly. Huge waves crashed over her bow, flooding the main deck. On one occasion in 1939, during a particularly violent storm, a massive wave struck the superstructure with such force that it buckled steel plates and destroyed equipment. The Hood had to return to port for extensive repairs. The incident raised questions about whether the ship's structure was weakening after years of service. Reports suggested that the constant stress of operating in the rough waters of the North Sea had created microfractures in critical parts of the hull. When the Hood engaged the Bismarck on that fateful May morning in 1941, she was not in perfect condition. The ship needed a complete overhaul, but war didn't allow for such a luxury. And when a shell from the Bismarck penetrated her weak deck armor and detonated an ammunition magazine, the ship exploded in a spectacular fireball and sank in less than 3 minutes. Of the 1,418 men on board, only 3 survived. Again, it wasn't just the weapons that killed them. It was the water. The Denmark Strait is even colder than the North Sea. Those who didn't die in the explosion and made it to the water died within minutes of hypothermia. Only those 3 men, through the extraordinary luck of being near a large piece of floating wreckage and being rescued quickly, lived to tell the tale. Returning specifically to the North Sea, one of the most disturbing aspects of shipwrecks in these waters is what happens next. The bottom of the North Sea is covered in wreckage. Estimates suggest there are over 5,000 shipwrecks on the seabed, dating back several centuries. Many are wooden ships from bygone eras, now little more than specks on the sand. But hundreds are from the 2 world wars, steel giants that still remain recognizable decades later. And these wrecks are themselves dangerous. Many of these sunken ships still contain munitions, cannon shells, torpedoes, unexploded mines, depth charges. These explosives, submerged in salt water for decades, are deteriorating. Their casings are corroding. Their chemical components are degrading, paradoxically making them more unstable. Fishermen dragging their nets across the bottom of the North Sea occasionally bring up shells or mines, an absolutely terrifying discovery. Bomb disposal squads are regularly called in to deal with World War II munitions found in the North Sea. And there is growing concern that as these wrecks continue to corrode, spontaneous explosions could occur on the seabed. Beyond explosives, there's the oil problem. Many of the ships that sank took with them thousands of tons of fuel oil. This oil remains in their tanks, sealed inside their broken hulls, slowly leaking out over the decades. It's an environmental disaster in slow motion. Some wrecks still release oil slicks onto the surface more than 70 years after they sank. There's debate about attempting to remove this oil, but the operation would be incredibly dangerous and expensive. For now, the wrecks remain as they are, environmental and explosive time bombs on the seabed. But beyond the physical dangers, there is something deeply unsettling about these wrecks. They are tombs. Most of these ships sank with at least some of their crew still on board. The bodies are long gone, of course, devoured by the sea and time. But there is something about knowing that these steel hulls are the final resting places of hundreds, perhaps thousands, of men who died in horrific ways. Crushed when compartments imploded under pressure, drowned when compartments flooded, burned when oil in the water ignited, or simply trapped in the dark as the ship sank, slowly dying as the air ran out. Divers exploring these wrecks where depth allows report an undeniably somber atmosphere. Even those who aren't superstitious speak of the emotional toll of swimming through corridors where men died, of seeing boots and helmets still where they were left in the final rush to abandon ship. It's a visceral reminder that each shipwreck represents not only the loss of a valuable piece of military equipment, but the extinction of entire communities. Each warship was a small floating city, with its own hierarchies, cultures, inside jokes and rivalries. When a ship sank, all of this disappeared within minutes. The statistics on North Sea shipwrecks during both world wars are staggering. During World War I, it is estimated that over 200 warships and merchant ships were lost in these waters. During World War II, the number was even higher, perhaps 300 or more. These figures include only those ships confirmed lost. There are likely dozens more that simply disappeared without a trace. And these figures do not include the thousands of merchant ships, fishing vessels and smaller vessels that also sank. The human cost is even more shocking. Tens of thousands of men died in the North Sea during these 2 wars. Some in battle, yes, but many simply from the conditions. Drowning, hypothermia, exhaustion. It's easy to see these men as statistics, numbers on a page in a history book. But each was an individual. Each had a family waiting at home. Each had dreams and hopes that died with him in the cold, dark waters. The surviving letters from these men, preserved in archives and museums, make moving reading. British sailors wrote home about how the North Sea storms were worse than any battle, about how they lay awake at night, listening to the hull groan and creak under the stress of the waves, wondering if this would be the night it would finally give way. German sailors described the dread of leaving the relative safety of port and knowing that in the coming hours or days they would be fighting not just the enemy, but the sea itself. These were not the complaints of cowards. They were the honest admissions of men facing terrible dangers most people could never imagine. And then there are the stories of extraordinary heroism. Men who remained at their posts as the ship sank, keeping the pumps running or the engines turning to give others time to escape. Men who returned to the icy water repeatedly to pull comrades to safety, even as they themselves succumbed to hypothermia. Captains who were the last to leave their ships, if at all. In many cases, captains chose to go down with their ships, seeing it as their duty. It's easy to dismiss this as archaic naval tradition, but for these men it was deeply real. They felt a personal responsibility for every man under their command, and when so many of those men died, some captains simply couldn't live with it. One of the most heartbreaking stories of the North Sea involves a small British patrol vessel in 1943, and the ship was on anti-submarine patrol when it was caught in a sudden storm. The storm was so severe that the ship was unable to maintain its course. It was pushed closer to the German-occupied coast, into waters known to be heavily mined. The captain faced an impossible choice: attempt to escape through the minefield and risk blowing up the ship, or remain where it was and be slowly destroyed by the waves. He chose to attempt escape. The ship managed to pass several mines, detecting them at the last moment and avoiding them by meters. But then, inevitably, they struck one. The explosion ripped off the ship's bow. Water gushed out. The ship began to sink immediately, but here's the remarkable part. The crew, instead of panicking, worked with calm efficiency. They knew the life rafts would be destroyed by the massive waves, so they improvised. Using whatever floating parts they could find, wood, empty drums, even life jackets tied together, they created flotation platforms. As the ship sank, all 37 men on board managed to grab something floating, and then in the middle of the storm, in the dark, in the icy waters, they held together. The captain shouted orders, keeping the men talking, keeping them awake, keeping them fighting the numbness of hypothermia. Hours passed. Men began to give up, their fingers slipping from their floating grips. But the others pulled them back, refusing to let anyone go. Miraculously, when the storm finally subsided at dawn, a British patrol plane spotted them. A rescue ship was dispatched and arrived 3 hours later. 29 of the 37 men were still alive. 8 had succumbed to hypothermia during the night, but the others survived because they refused to give up and because their comrades refused to abandon them. It's a story of human resilience and brotherhood that almost defies belief. But for every story of miraculous survival, there are dozens where there were no happy endings. Ships that sank so quickly, there was no time to send distress signals. Crews who fought bravely, but were simply overwhelmed by the combination of enemy fire and raging seas. Men who reached the water, only to find that their lifeboats had been destroyed or that the sea was covered in burning oil, forcing them to choose between drowning or burning. One of the most frustrating aspects for naval commanders was the North Sea's unpredictability. They could send out a patrol in perfectly reasonable conditions, and 6 hours later, a storm could develop, making rescue impossible. Radio and communications improved over time, but during World War I, once a ship was at sea, it was essentially on its own. If it encountered trouble far from major trade routes, it could be days before anyone realized it was missing. And in the North Sea, days meant any survivors were almost certainly already dead. Technology improved during World War II. Radar could detect ships in distress. Planes could be sent to search for survivors. But even so, the North Sea remained unforgiving. In 1944, a British destroyer was split in half by a colossal wave during a winter storm. The wave, estimated to be over 20 meters high, simply snapped the ship like a twig. The two halves sank in less than 2 minutes. Nearby ships detected the SOS, but when they arrived on the scene less than an hour later, they found no survivors. The water was so cold that the men simply could not have survived that long. Giant waves, sometimes called rogue waves or freak waves, were particularly feared in the North Sea. These waves appear seemingly out of nowhere, much larger than the surrounding waves, and can be absolutely devastating. For many years, these waves were considered sailors' myths. Scientists believed that reports of 20, 25, or even 30-meter waves emerging from relatively calm seas were exaggerations or misperceptions. But then, in 1995, a North Sea oil platform called WWII recorded a wave 25.5 meters high. The measurement was made by precise instruments, not by frightened human eyes. The wave was more than twice the height of the surrounding waves. Its existence confirmed what sailors had always known. The North Sea can produce waves that defy the normal laws of marine physics. These monstrous waves are created when several smaller waves combine at a specific moment, concentrating their energy into a single wall of water. In the North Sea, with its shallow waters and complex currents, the conditions are perfect for this phenomenon. And when one of these waves hits a ship, especially one already struggling in rough seas, the result can be catastrophic. The wave doesn't just flood the deck. Its impact can bend steel, break welds, and destroy entire superstructures. Ships that have survived direct engagements with enemy vessels have been torn in half by these waves. German naval records from World War II contain particularly detailed accounts of these waves. The Kriegsmarine kept meticulous diaries, and several captains described encounters with what they called Kavensmann, an old German term for these giant waves. One submarine captain described being on the surface at night, recharging batteries, when a wall of water simply appeared out of the darkness. He estimated its height to be at least 20 meters. The wave completely swept across the submarine's deck, sweeping men from their posts. 2 crew members were swept away and never seen again. The submarine made an emergency dive, but the impact had damaged its snorkel and antennas. They were lucky to survive. Many other submarines simply disappeared, and it is likely that at least some fell victim to these colossal waves. The psychological aspect of serving in the North Sea cannot be underestimated. The men who patrolled these waters lived under constant stress. It wasn't just the fear of combat, although that was certainly present. It was the knowledge that at any moment the sea could simply decide to kill them, that they could be performing routine tasks on a clear day and minutes later be fighting for their lives as their ship was torn apart by the waves. This stress manifested itself in various ways. Some men developed what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, waking from nightmares about drowning, unable to relax even on land. Others became superstitious, developing elaborate rituals they believed kept them safe. And some simply numbed themselves emotionally, shutting off their feelings as a survival mechanism. Medical officers on British warships during World War II began to recognize what they called North Sea fatigue. Men who had served on patrols in these waters for prolonged periods showed signs of extreme exhaustion, not only physical but also mental. Their reflexes slowed. They made errors in judgment. Some developed what appeared to be physical symptoms, tremors, digestive problems, constant headaches, but these had no obvious medical cause. Eventually, the Royal Navy implemented more frequent rotation policies for North Sea crews, recognizing that even the toughest men had their limits. For submariners, conditions were even more challenging. Submarines of the time were essentially surface vessels that could submerge temporarily. They spent most of their time on the surface, where they were vulnerable to both the weather and enemy detection. When submerged, conditions on board were claustrophobic and uncomfortable. But when forced to remain submerged for prolonged periods due to enemy ships above or storms on the surface, it became nearly unbearable. The air became stale and humid. Moisture condensed on every surface. The men were unable to wash. They shared bunks in shifts. And all the while, they knew they were in a metal tube on the seabed, their survival dependent on equipment that could fail at any moment. Several German submarines sank in the North Sea under circumstances that suggest equipment failure, exacerbated by harsh sea conditions. The U-boat would be trapped underwater, unable to blow its ballast tanks to surface, perhaps because a valve had frozen or a line had been damaged by excessive pressure while diving deep to avoid depth charges. The men inside would gradually realize they were doomed. The air would become increasingly difficult to breathe. Darkness would be complete, except for a few dim emergency lights. The cold of the sea would seep through the hull. And eventually, when the air ran out, they would simply fall asleep and die. To their commanders on shore, the submarine simply would not return. It would be listed as missing, presumed lost to enemy action. But the truth in many cases was much darker. Mine warfare in the North Sea deserves special mention, as it posed a constant and invisible danger. Both sides dropped thousands of mines in these waters. The British mines were designed to float about 3 to 5 meters below the surface, attached to the seabed by steel cables. The idea was that they would be below the hulls of merchant ships and passenger vessels, but would intercept warships with deeper drafts. In practice, the placement was less precise than expected. Currents could tear mines from their moorings. Storms could cause cables to break, and the mines themselves could drift, creating dangers in areas previously considered safe. Minesweepers had one of the most dangerous jobs of the war. They deliberately sailed through areas suspected of containing mines, dragging cutting lines designed to sever the mine's moorings and bring them to the surface, where they could be destroyed by rifle fire. It was nerve-wracking and tedious work. Hours and hours of slow navigation in grid patterns, knowing that at any moment you could hit a mine your lines missed, and once a mine was brought to the surface, it had to be detonated, which meant getting dangerously close to it. Minesweepers were occasionally destroyed by the very mines they were trying to clear. And in the North Sea, with its often rough waters and limited visibility, the work was even more dangerous. A particularly disturbing statistic is how many ships were sunk by their own mines. On several occasions, storms tore mines from British or German minefields and pushed them back into routes used by the nation that had laid them. Military and merchant ships were sent to the bottom by weapons their own sides had placed there. It was a particularly cruel form of friendly fire, although technically no one fired a shot. The sailors who died in these circumstances were killed by a combination of the arrogance of their own commanders, who thought they could control where the mines would lie, and the North Sea, which cared nothing for human plans. The logistics of keeping fleets operating in the North Sea were challenging. Ships required constant maintenance. Saltwater corroded metal. Constant operation in rough seas caused wear and tear on machinery. Gaskets failed, allowing water to seep into compartments that should have been watertight. Valves jammed. Pipes cracked. A modern warship was an incredibly complex machine, and the longer it spent at sea, especially in harsh conditions, the more problems it developed. Engineering crews worked grueling shifts keeping everything running, but there was a limit to what could be accomplished at sea. Eventually, ships had to return to port for proper repairs. But during the war, docks were prime bombing targets. German shipyards in Wilhelmshaven, Kiel, and Hamburg were repeatedly bombed by Allied aircraft. British installations at Scapa Flow, Rosyth, and other locations were attacked by German bombers. Ships in desperate need of repair were sometimes forced to remain at sea because it was simply too dangerous to bring them into port. This created a vicious cycle. Ships became increasingly damaged and unreliable, making them more vulnerable to both combat and sea conditions, but they could not be adequately repaired. Some ships literally fell apart due to this forced neglect, their hulls simply failing after months of temporary repairs and continued stress. Crews developed an intimate knowledge of their ships. They could tell by the sound of the engines if something was wrong. They knew every creak and groan of the hull, could distinguish between the normal sounds of a ship in rough seas and the sounds that meant something was failing. This intimacy sometimes saved ships. An alert crew could spot an emerging problem and deal with it before it became catastrophic. But it also meant they knew exactly how precarious their situation was. They could hear the hull plates flexing in ways they shouldn't. They could feel vibrations that indicated welds were failing, and they carried this knowledge with them, knowing their ship was literally disintegrating around them, but unable to do much about it other than keep pumping water and praying. The arrival of winter made everything exponentially worse. The North Sea was challenging in summer. In winter it was truly hellish. Air temperatures dropped well below freezing. The water rarely froze, as salinity and constant movement prevented it, but its temperature dropped to just a few degrees above freezing. Icy fogs reduced visibility to virtually nothing. Ice formed on ships' superstructures, accumulating in layers that could weigh tons, making the ships top-heavy and dangerously unstable. Crews had to go out on deck with hammers and sledgehammers to break the ice, a dangerous task in itself, as the deck was slippery and waves could easily sweep men overboard. There are reports of ships literally capsizing due to the weight of the ice on their superstructures. The ship would simply become so top-heavy that it lost its stability. A large wave would tilt it, and instead of righting itself, it would continue rolling until it completely capsized. The men trapped inside wouldn't stand a chance. The ship would sink in seconds, taking them with it. Those who managed to escape would find themselves in the freezing water, where they would have minutes, perhaps, before hypothermia killed them. It was one of the quickest and most horrific ways to die at sea. During the winter of 1942-1943, the Kriegsmarine lost several destroyers in the North Sea, not to enemy action, but simply to the weather. One was found capsized, floating upside down, its keel pointing skyward. No survivors were found. Another simply disappeared during a particularly severe storm. Pieces of wreckage were found weeks later, washed up on the beaches of Norway, but no bodies. The sea had taken everything. These were not small or old ships. They were modern destroyers, well-built and well-manned. But the North Sea in winter cared nothing for such distinctions. The Royal Navy suffered its own devastating losses during these winter months. Trains running along the east coast of England to Scapa Flow and beyond faced horrific conditions. Merchant ships, many of them aging and poorly maintained, were loaded with essential supplies and forced to sail through storms that should have kept them in port. The imperative of war brooked no delay, so they would sail and some would sink. Naval escorts did what they could, but they could not control the weather. Watching a merchant ship break up in heavy seas, knowing there was nothing that could be done to help, was a traumatic experience that haunted sailors for decades afterward. One of the lesser-known North Sea disasters occurred in January 1945. A convoy of 5 merchant ships and 3 escorts was sailing along the coast of Scotland when it was hit by a winter storm of exceptional ferocity. Winds were estimated at over 80 miles per hour. Waves exceeded 15 meters. The ships could not maintain formation. Visibility was zero due to the snow and spray. And in the chaos, 2 of the merchant ships simply disappeared. The escorts searched for hours after the storm subsided, but found nothing. No wreckage, no bodies, no sign that the ships had ever existed. It was as if the sea had erased them from reality. More than 100 men died that day, and for decades their families were unsure exactly what had happened. Official records simply stated lost at sea. This aspect of North Sea shipwrecks, the uncertainty they left behind, was perhaps as cruel as the deaths themselves. When a ship sank in battle, at least there was clarity. There were enemies, there were witnesses, there was a narrative. But when a ship simply disappeared during a storm, there was no closure. Families were left with unanswered questions. Had their loved ones died quickly when the ship sank? Or had they survived in the water for hours, waiting for rescue that never came? Had they suffered? Not knowing in many cases was worse than knowing the truth. Governments tried to provide some solace. Letters were sent, saying that loved ones had died serving their country, that they had been brave to the end. But these were empty words to people who simply wanted their husbands, sons and fathers to return home. War demanded these sacrifices, the officers said. The North Sea was essential to the war effort. The patrols, the convoys, the naval engagements, all were necessary for victory. And perhaps that was true, but it didn't make the deaths any less tragic, didn't fill the empty seats at dinner tables, didn't soothe the children who cried for parents they would never see again. After the war, efforts were made to recover some of the sunken ships. Salvage operations were launched on several wrecks, particularly those in shallower waters near the coast. The primary objective was often to recover non-ferrous metals, especially bronze and brass, which were of significant value. But divers who descended to these wrecks found haunting sights. Ships that had sunk upright were still recognizable decades later. Hatches gaped like dark mouths. Cannons still pointed in the directions they had last been. Personal effects scattered about, teacups, uniforms, photographs rendered unrecognizable by the water, but still clearly pictures of families and loved ones. What the divers didn't find for the most part were bodies. The North Sea is cold, but not cold enough to preserve bodies indefinitely. And there is abundant life on the seafloor. Crabs, fish, other creatures that quickly consume morphic tissue. Within weeks, little would remain of a human body other than bones. And even the bones, in many cases, were scattered or buried in the mud and sand of the seafloor. So the wrecks were haunted not by physical presences, but by absences, by empty spaces where men had stood, by objects that had been held by hands now long gone. Some wrecks have been declared war graves and protected by law. It is illegal to dive on them or disturb them in any way. They should be left as memorials to the men who died there. This is a sensible and respectful policy. But there is something deeply melancholy about knowing that these steel and iron monuments are slowly eroding on the seabed, out of sight and increasingly out of memory. In a few decades, or perhaps centuries, they will be completely gone, disintegrated by the relentless action of salt water. And when that happens, the last physical trace of these men will be gone. The North Sea today is very different from what it was during the World Wars. There are no longer naval battles in its waters. The ships that traverse it now are merchant ships, oil tankers, container ships and passenger ferries. Oil rigs dot its surface, extracting oil and gas from the seabed. It is an industrialized place, tamed to some extent by modern technology, but the sea itself hasn't changed. It still produces storms of terrifying ferocity. It can still generate those giant waves that appear out of nowhere. Modern ships are still lost, although much less frequently thanks to better weather forecasts, stronger construction, and more efficient rescue systems. But the fishermen who work these waters, the oil rig crews, the ship's pilots who guide large merchant vessels through the North Sea, they all have a healthy respect for it. They know that beneath the modern surface, the ancient sea still lingers, still dangerous, still unforgiving, still perfectly capable of killing those who underestimate it. Technologies have changed, but the fundamental nature of the North Sea hasn't, and likely never will. There is something to be learned from the stories of these sunken ships and the men who died in them. It's easy in the safety of land to forget how dangerous the sea is. It's easy to see the oceans as highways for trade, as resources to be exploited, as obstacles to be overcome. But the sea is none of these things, not really. The sea is a force of nature, as powerful and indifferent as a volcano or an earthquake. It doesn't hate those who sail upon it, but neither does it care about their well-being. It simply exists, following its own laws, responding to atmospheric and gravitational forces that have little to do with human affairs. The men who died in the North Sea during the World Wars were no fools. They knew the risks. Many of them were seasoned sailors who had spent years at sea. But they were sent anyway, because the necessities of war demanded it. And some of them paid the ultimate price. Not for lack of courage or skill, but simply because sometimes, no matter how good you are, no matter how strong your ship, no matter how experienced your crew, the sea wins. And when it wins, it leaves no room for second chances. As we reflect on these stories, we must remember that each statistic represents a real life. Each sunken ship represents hundreds of individual stories cut short. Young men who would never marry, never have children, never realize their dreams. Older men torn from their families, leaving behind widows and orphans. Each of them mattered to someone. Each of them was loved. And they all deserved better than to die scared and cold in the dark waters of the North Sea. But we must also remember their courage. These men faced terrible dangers, not just once but repeatedly. They went on patrols knowing they might not return. They remained at their posts through storms that terrified them. They pulled comrades from the icy water, even when exhausted. They did their jobs with professional efficiency, even when every instinct screamed panic. This is true courage, not the absence of fear, but the ability to function despite it. The lessons of the North Sea go beyond naval history. They speak to humanity's relationship with nature. For millennia, we have tried to conquer the natural world, bend it to our will, and we have had remarkable successes. We have built cities, diverted rivers, leveled mountains, but the sea remains largely untamed. We can build bigger and better ships. We can develop sophisticated weather forecasts, but we still cannot control the ocean itself. And perhaps that is just as well. Perhaps we need these reminders that there are forces in this world greater than ourselves. Forces that do not bend to human desires. The North Sea swallowed warships in mere hours, not out of malice, but simply because that is its nature. It is a place where ocean and atmosphere meet in particularly volatile ways, where shallow waters and strong winds create conditions that can destroy even the proudest creations of human engineering. It is a reminder that despite all our technological progress, we are still small before the forces of nature. And those who go to sea, whether in times of war or peace, carry with them the understanding that they may not return. As we conclude this journey through the turbulent waters of history, we recognize that these tales of courage, sacrifice, and the relentless force of nature teach us about the limits of human ambition and the importance of humility before creation. May the souls of those who rest in the depths of the North Sea find eternal peace, and may their stories never be forgotten. We thank the Lord God for allowing us to tell these stories, for giving us the ability to learn from the past, and for reminding us that every life is precious and every loss is worthy of mourning. May we honor the memory of these men by living with purpose, courage, and compassion, ever aware that we are part of something greater than ourselves, and that our existence is both a gift and a responsibility before the Creator of all things.